Hello. Thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. Back in January of 2004, four students from Harvard University created an online social network where the other students in their school could post pictures as well as information about themselves, like their class schedule, clubs they belong to, their hobbies and their interests. And it really took off at Harvard University to the point that over the next few months, other students from other universities were trying to get on the website and eventually allowed to. And here we are, 20 years later, and we've discovered that Facebook has become the largest medium of advertisement in the world. According to reports, Meta, the parent company of Facebook, made $131 billion last year alone from advertisements that were aimed to create new and effective customer relationships. We live in a consumer society. It's one that's driven by technology. Your smartphone, your computer, your streaming devices all create this environment where ads and marketing are given this unlimited access to our consciousness. Every time you visit social media, you're going to be greeted with a link that directs you to the next must-have gadget or gizmo. And so as we get started today, I'm wondering, when was the last time you bought something that you didn't really need? I read a report that last year, the average American spent $1,500 a month on non-essential purchases. They defined non-essential purchases as things that are like a steel water cup that you saw on social media or an impulse item that you bought for your home decor, your gym membership, manicures, video games, Netflix. All of those are non-essential. And I'm not immune to that. I mean, I have a gym membership. I bought new luggage a couple weeks ago for a trip that I'm going to take this summer. My heart beats a little faster when I get a text telling me that my Amazon purchase has arrived. In our home, we have subscriptions to Netflix, HBO Max, Disney Plus. I don't do real well in bin stores or closeout stores or clearance aisles because I see things that I really don't have any need for whatsoever, but it's such a great deal, you just got to buy it anyway. And the reason that I'm admitting all that to you today is because we've made it to the fifth of the deadly sins, greed. And unlike lust, pride, or anger, greed is common in our culture to the point that we see it more as a right than a sin. John Foreman wrote that greed, envy, sloth, pride, and gluttony, these are not vices anymore. They're marketing tools. Lust is our way of life. Envy nudges us towards another sale. And if he's right, and I'm afraid that he is, then this constant barrage of advertisements feed our need to have one more thing. And it's the Pied Piper that leads us away from what we actually want most in this life. How much money, how much fame, how much attention, how much success or pleasure or possessions do you need to find the happiness that you believe you deserve? I think we can ask that question a lot of different ways, but the issue with the fifth deadly sin is not how much money or possessions you have or you don't have. I mean, you understand that greed has no concern of your economic standing. You'll find greedy among the very poor. They have very little, but what they do have, they clutch onto like a lifeline, falsely believing that the few dollars in their pockets will bring them the security that they want most in this life. And you'll also find greed among people that are very rich, because having money doesn't take away this temptation to just have a little more. The ability to possess things doesn't kill our desire to possess more. Greed is seen in our attitude towards what can be possessed or what can be owned. It's not confined to an economic status. It's not confined to an age bracket. I know we tend to think that old misers like Ebenezer Scrooge are the greedy, but children are just as greedy, whether they hide their favorite toys when a friend comes over or they play with them in plain sight and refuse to share. Mama might be the first word a child says, but mine is the word they use the most. We need to understand that greed isn't just about money. You can be greedy for all kinds of things. You can be greedy for power, greedy for fame, greedy for food. So if you don't have a lot of stuff, don't assume you're safe. Don't assume that this temptation is for somebody else. And if you have an abundance of stuff, don't think for 1 minute that you're safe from the sin of greed. The Bible has an awful lot to say about greed and our attitude towards money or possessions. I mean, we could spend hours talking about Achan, Gehaziah, King Saul, Judas. But today I want to draw your attention to the story of Ahab, the king of Israel. As the king, Ahab already possessed everything but character. He was wealthy. He had ivory, silver, gold, male and female servants, cattle, land. And one day he's looking out his window and he sees a vineyard. He gets this great idea. That vineyard would make a beautiful vegetable garden. The only problem is that it was owned by a man named Naboth. We find the story in 1 Kings 21. One day Ahab says to Naboth, "Since your vineyard is so convenient to my palace, I would like to buy it and use it as a vegetable garden. I will give you a better vineyard in exchange, or if you prefer, I will pay you for it." But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance that was passed down by my ancestors." You might remember that when Israel first took possession of the promised land, every family received a portion of that land. God said, "This is your inheritance. It's supposed to be passed down from generation to generation. Don't ever sell the land." So Naboth couldn't sell the vineyard because he was trying to be obedient to God's instructions. But instead of respecting Naboth's reasons for not selling the land, we read that Ahab went home angrily and pouting because of Naboth's answer. The king went to bed with his face to the wall and refused to eat. Ahab chose to act like a spoiled 3-year-old. His reaction, though, hits a little closer home than I want to admit, because he does what we all do. He became over-focused on what he didn't have. Ahab had an abundance of wealth and land and possessions, but instead of thinking about all that he had and being thankful, he pouted, crawled into bed because he didn't get his way. Greed is often seen in how we react when we don't get what we want. What happens when you want to redecorate your bedroom or buy new golf clubs or get a new outfit or go on a vacation and your spouse says, "I'm sorry, but we're on a tight budget. We just can't afford that"? The way that you react to that news tells the truth about your heart. If you shop around and try to find the best price just to show them how much money you can save with this purchase, or if you nag or sulk or give your spouse the silent treatment, if you whine or complain that you deserve to treat yourself every now and then for all the hard work that you do, that's a heart problem. When Ahab chose to sulk long enough to irritate Jezebel, who's a perfect example of what a wife shouldn't be, he's showing the condition of his heart. When Jezebel finds out about Naboth's refusal to give up the vineyard, she gets this plot in motion to have Naboth murdered. And because she's queen, her plan works out. When Jezebel hears that Naboth was stoned to death, she says to Ahab, "You know the vineyard Naboth wouldn't sell to you? Well, you can have it now. He's dead." So Ahab immediately went down to the vineyard of Naboth to claim it. The issue in this text is that Ahab and Jezebel were being led by their greed. Their greed caused them to want to break the law of God concerning the land. Their greed causes Jezebel to lie and to get others to conspire to lie about Naboth's character. Their greed led them to murder an innocent man and caused heartache and pain for his family. But greed never notices, it never sees all that. Greed is only focused on what it wants. And while it might sound pretty cut and dry, greed's really not an easy subject for us to understand. I mean, how do you identify greed? Are we greedy because we live in a nice, spacious home furnished with all the conveniences of modern life when there are millions of people around the world that live in shacks and have no indoor plumbing? Are we being greedy if we have nice cars in our driveway or money in a savings account or our 401k? How do we identify it? I've discovered in my own life that I can check my struggle with greed by seeing how difficult it is for me to be generous. Greedy people aren't generous, and generous people aren't greedy. In 1 John 3:17, John writes, "If you see some brother or sister in need and you have the means to do something about it, but turn a cold shoulder and do nothing, then God's love's not living in that person." Our struggle with greed can be measured by how tightly we hold on to the things that we already possess. Maybe you've noticed that the more money and stuff that you accumulate, the more money, time, and energy you need to protect and to take care of it. You might have been seduced into this thought that by having more stuff, you're given a bigger sense of security, but really it just kind of does the opposite. Wealth actually increases our worry, our insecurity, and our drive and desire to have more. Over 8,000 years ago, Thomas Aquinas wrote, "There are two major obstacles to our generosity." And what I find interesting is that those two reasons are still prevalent in our culture today. He says the first reason that we struggle with generosity is because it's hard for us to give away something that we earned. When we work for something, we feel a sense of ownership. We feel like it's a part of us. Greed is not about having more as much as it's about holding on to this idea that I own this, it's mine. And that's been a constant theme in our lives. My house is mine. Everything in my house is mine. Everything in the bank account is mine because I earned it. I brought home a paycheck. It's mine. And it's hard to be generous with something that I worked hard for. Thomas also said that the second thing that makes generosity difficult is when you've experienced poverty. If there's ever been a time in your life when you've been in great need, it affects your willingness to let go of money and possessions. I can remember when Tristan and I worked for a church where some of our older members would actually wash the paper plates after a fellowship meal because they didn't want to waste the money to buy new plates. They had that attitude because they had lived through the Great Depression, and their fear of poverty was really difficult for them to let go of. Aquinas taught that people who have worked to buy what they need and those who have struggled and gone without the things they need are the ones who will most likely struggle with greed. So we find ourselves in 2024 living in a world that has advanced in medicine, technology, culture, and information. And whether you've worked hard to earn something or you've gone without, you're still struggling with the sin of greed. In the book of Proverbs, Solomon says the way that we overcome the sin of greed in our life is to share what we have and to share life with others. People that struggle with greed close their eyes to the needs of others. We refuse to see our neighbor who needs help fixing their car, or the single mom at church who really needs those baby clothes that we have tucked away in a box in the attic. We don't think about the homeless person we pass by on the way to the grocery store. We don't see the teenager who doesn't get the encouragement that they need at home. Solomon says greed is foolishness, but there's wisdom in being generous and sharing life with one another. Solomon says that sharing demonstrates God's kindness. In Proverbs 19:17, he says, "Every time you give to the poor, you make a loan to the Lord. Don't worry, you'll be repaid in full for all the good you've done." There's this relationship between being godly and being generous, which means the opposite is true. When you give into your greed, it takes you away from God. Solomon understands that everything comes back to your motivation. In the Hebrew, the word poor is a general term. It means anyone that has a need. It's not just somebody who's homeless or destitute. Anybody that you come across that needs a little kindness, a little compassion, is poor. And the way that you show them that kindness can take lots of different forms. You might help somebody pay a bill and ease their financial stress for the month. You might give your time to rake the leaves of your neighbor or anyone that's in bad health that can't get out and do that. You might stop and talk with somebody who our society often overlooks and help them feel valued. It doesn't have to be extravagant. I know in my life, often we convince ourselves that we don't have anything to share because we have so little time or finances or treasure. But I also remember that when Trafton was a baby, somebody in our congregation would periodically place a box of diapers on our car after church in the parking lot. And every time I walked out to that car and saw those diapers, saw that beautiful gift, I wanted to cry. Because that meant that week I didn't have to spend $29 on diapers and I could afford to change the oil in the car or we could meet our grocery budget. Solomon says that when we show kindness by giving to people who have need, actually what we're doing is we're giving to God, and God will reward you for the kindness that you've shown. When we show kindness to the needy, we're actually showing kindness and love to God. The promise is that when you do that, when you give to the needy, you're giving to God, and God will take care of you. The second thing that Solomon says is that when we share life with others, we open ourselves to blessings. Once again, from the book of Proverbs in chapter 28, we read, "You will never go without if you give to the poor, but if you're heartless, stingy, and selfish, you invite curses upon yourself." Your compassion, generosity, and kindness is seen in your ability to share with people that have need. And there's an added benefit. The more that you give, the more that you discover you have to give. You see, our greed tells us we got to hold on to what we have because if it's taken from us, we'll have less. When the truth is, we were created to be the vessel through which God's blessings flow. Greed tells us you need to hold on tightly to everything you have, yet God gives us all of these blessings and good gifts to share, trusting that He's going to continue to bless us with the things that we need so we can have joy in our relationship with Him. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes the promise that the same God that dresses the flowers of the field and feeds the birds of the air is able to take care of you. We're not supposed to get so preoccupied with getting. Instead, we should respond to God's giving through joy and blessing and giving to others. God desires to pour His blessings in our lives, but in order for us to experience the life God has intended for us, we have to share those blessings with others. Blessings flow in, blessings flow out through the things that we share. And if we choose to not share our lives and our blessings with those around us, we're actually closing the door so that God can't bless us. Yet if we joyfully share our blessings with others, then we open those doors to receive even more of God's blessings. A greedy man spends his day thinking about all the things they don't have. A greedy man might have a large bank account, but they're not satisfied with that. They only focus on what they don't possess, and they're not going to let anything go because all they see is loss. Whereas a generous person doesn't want for much. They have enough because they have enough to share. People who receive the love of God and they love Him with all of their hearts seem unaffected by this drive for more. When people share, they counteract the craving to accumulate other stuff. And we understand that our souls can only be filled with God and not the trash that we often accumulate, but we still have this strong desire to collect things that are actually worthless. I'd be willing to guarantee that in your home right now, there's a drawer, probably in the kitchen, that's overflowing with junk. It's probably got wires in there, an old birthday card, an empty matchbook, or whatever treasure you're holding on to. And you know deep down that you probably just need to take that drawer out, turn it over the garbage can, and just throw it all away. Just dump it all. But yet we keep it. And we keep it because it fills this need that we have to possess something, because we crave more and more. And not necessarily the newest and the greatest. Sometimes we just want stuff. I mean, we live in a country that has a television show called Hoarders, and there is a waiting list of people to be on that show. And the truth is, as long as we refuse to share, our appetite for more continues to grow. We just collect all of this garbage to the point that we allow it to drown out our desire for God. Greed is one of the deadly sins because it's rooted in pride. It makes us believe that we have to provide for ourselves, which is easier than waiting on God. Having an abundance of stuff helps us feel secure. Greed is the desire to be able to provide for us and not to have to wait on God or God's timing. The cure to greed is not to live on a crust of bread and threadbare clothes. The cure to greed is to live your life in such a way that you're free from being enslaved by your stuff. Money and possessions are neutral items. They can be useful. I mean, Jesus did spend time fasting on numerous occasions, but he also spent time feasting and celebrating. Our problem is whenever our lives are filled with greed, we forget what enough means. So as we get ready to make our way to the tables, I want to encourage you to imitate Jesus by practicing the art of giving. The best way to combat the sin of greed in our lives is to make a conscious effort to give more time, more talent, more treasure to those who are in need. And the more that we trust God by letting go of our possessions, the less control those possessions will have in our lives. I want us to get out of the habit of spending everything that we want on ourselves and then just giving what's left over. I believe that if we look for ways to give to others first, we're forced to acknowledge that everything that we own is actually God's in the first place. And God can use that however He wants. And it's a way of trusting that God will continue to provide for all of our needs. As we gather to take the bread and the cup, we're given the opportunity to remember how much God has already given us. And it also gives us the chance to be hopeful that He will continue to bless us, to take care of our needs, that as long as we pour out, He will continue to pour in. I hope you have a wonderful time around the table today. And I hope that, especially today, as you sit around the table, you'll be able to focus on the fact that God has already taken care of all of your needs. Have a wonderful week. Know that you're loved. And I look forward to seeing you very soon.